It was the perfect Saturday afternoon. The sun hung high in the sky, casting golden rays that filtered through the leaves of the old oak tree in the backyard. The soft breeze swirled around, making the day feel almost magical. Laura, wearing a relaxed smile, sat on the back porch, sipping her iced tea as she soaked in the peacefulness of the moment. She loved these quiet afternoons. Life with her daughter Emma and their two loyal dogs felt complete. Emma, her energetic 5-year-old, was chasing a butterfly around the yard, her little giggles filling the air. She wore a bright pink dress that twirled as she spun in circles, lost in the joy of the simple game. Max and Daisy, the family's two dogs, were nearby, lounging in the shade of the porch. Max, a large, muscular German shepherd, lay sprawled out lazily, his eyes half closed. Daisy, a smaller but just as protective border collie, was curled up by his side, her head resting on her paws. At first glance, everything seemed peaceful, idyllic even. But as Laura took another sip of her tea, something felt off. It wasn't anything specific, just a subtle change in the air, a sense that the dogs were no longer at ease. She noticed Max, who had been lying quietly just moments before, suddenly raise his head. His ears twitched, and his gaze shifted to the edge of the yard, where the trees grew thick and dense. His posture straightened, his muscles tensing, and his once relaxed body now seemed poised for something. Waiting, watching. Daisy, too, had shifted. Her usually calm, playful nature was gone, replaced with a focused intensity. She stood up slowly, her eyes darting around the yard as if scanning every corner, every shadow. Laura frowned, feeling the change in the dog's behavior, but she didn't immediately understand why. The dogs weren't known for being easily startled, so this was unusual. She glanced over at Emma, still blissfully unaware of the shift in atmosphere, as she twirled and giggled in the grass. The girl's laughter seemed to fill the empty spaces between the trees, a stark contrast to the growing tension in the air. Max and Daisy, however, were no longer just observing. They were now moving in sync, almost as if they were working together to form a protective perimeter around Emma. Every time she took a few steps, the dogs mirrored her movements, staying close but never crowding her. It wasn't normal behavior. Laura set her glass down on the table, her eyes narrowing as she tried to figure out what had caught the dog's attention. Was there something in the woods? Something they could hear, see, or smell that she couldn't? She shook the feeling of unease but couldn't quite ignore it. The peaceful afternoon she had so often cherished was quickly slipping away, and with it, her sense of safety. The dogs weren't just watching, they were guarding. But what were they protecting Emma from? Laura's curiosity grew as she watched Max and Daisy, both now standing alert with their eyes fixed on the edge of the woods. Their bodies were taut, muscles rigid, as if ready to spring into action at any moment. Max's low growl, a sound she rarely heard from him, rumbled from deep within his chest. Daisy, usually so calm, was now on high alert, her stance more defensive than playful. The change in their behavior was too noticeable to ignore. Her first instinct was to brush it off, to believe that the dogs were just being overly protective, but deep down, a nagging feeling told her something wasn't right. She glanced again at Emma, who was still blissfully unaware of the growing tension. Emma was kneeling down, gently inspecting a cluster of wildflowers by the fence, her little hands brushing over the petals with the innocence of a child who didn't know the world could be anything but kind. Laura's eyes darted from the dogs to her daughter, then back to the trees. There was something out there. She could feel it now, a shift in the air, a sense of waiting. The wind had stopped, leaving an unnatural stillness behind. Even the birds, usually chirping happily in the distance, had gone silent. Max's growl grew louder, a low warning sound that seemed to vibrate in the silence. His eyes were locked onto something just beyond the tree line, and Daisy, too, began to pace, her tail held low. The protective instinct in them both was undeniable. They weren't simply reacting to a noise or a passing animal. They were guarding with a purpose, as if something more serious was at play. Laura took a slow step forward, her eyes scanning the yard. Her pulse quickened, but she told herself it was just the dogs being cautious, nothing more. Maybe a rabbit or squirrel had startled them. Maybe there was a deer wandering through the edge of the forest. But no matter how much she tried to convince herself, the unease wouldn't fade. Her eyes kept returning to the dogs. They were no longer relaxed, no longer simply watching. They were focused, intent on something, perhaps something they had sensed that she hadn't. As she walked closer to the dogs, she noticed the way they were standing, not just alert, but blocking the path between Emma and the woods as if forming a protective barrier. They seemed almost coordinated, aware of one another's movements, working as a team. The hairs on the back of Laura's neck stood up. It was then that she realized it. They weren't just reacting to the environment. They were protecting Emma, and she didn't know what from. A chill ran down her spine, and the quiet peacefulness of the afternoon began to feel like a distant memory. The air now felt charged, as though something unseen was lurking just out of sight. The dogs were on edge, and so was she. Laura's heart rate quickened as she stepped closer to Max and Daisy. The air felt heavy, thick with an unspoken warning. The dog's eyes were locked on the same spot near the edge of the woods, but they didn't flinch when she approached. Max, usually so responsive to her presence, didn't even look at her as she knelt beside him. His focus remained entirely on the tree line, his ears perked, his stance still rigid. Daisy, too, stood firmly in place, her body lowered, ready to spring into action if necessary. Laura reached out to pat her head, hoping to offer some comfort, but Daisy didn't react. It was as if the dog was in another world, one that Laura couldn't access, a world of instinct and silent communication between the dogs. Daisy's eyes darted back and forth, never leaving the woods, her entire being vibrating with tension. Max, Daisy. Laura's voice was soft but filled with concern. She wasn't used to this, to the dogs acting so distant, so focused. Max finally broke his gaze and glanced up at her, but there was no relief in his eyes. Instead, a deeper, more intense feeling lingered there, as if he was silently urging her to stay back. As if to say, "Don't come any closer." Emma, still unaware of the growing anxiety in the yard, was now crouched near the base of the fence, examining a patch of moss. She hummed to herself, her small fingers tracing the patterns in the dirt. Laura's mind raced. She needed to get Emma inside. The dogs were clearly trying to protect her, but they couldn't be expected to keep her safe from whatever was lurking in the woods. Without taking her eyes off the dogs, Laura slowly rose to her feet. Her voice, though shaky, remained calm. "Emma, honey, why don't you come over here? It's time to go inside for a snack." Emma looked up at her, smiling. "Okay, Mommy," she chirped, standing up and brushing her hands on her dress. She turned to walk toward Laura, but before she could take a full step, something happened that made the air crackle with urgency. Max's low growl escalated into a fierce, guttural sound, the kind Laura had never heard before. His body tensed even further, and Daisy moved swiftly into position, stepping between Emma and the woods. Max barked sharply, each bark more aggressive than the last. Laura froze, her blood running cold. This wasn't the playful warning Max would give if a squirrel had wandered into the yard. This was something serious. Laura's heart hammered in her chest as she scooped Emma up into her arms, moving as quickly as she could. "Come on, sweetheart, we need to go inside. Now." Emma clung to her, sensing the change in the air. "What's wrong, Mommy?" she asked, her voice soft and innocent. "Nothing, baby, we just need to go inside. Let's go." Laura's voice was firmer now, her eyes never leaving the dogs, who were still standing between her daughter and the woods. Max and Daisy remained motionless, their eyes fixed on the dark shadows beneath the trees, as if daring anything to come closer. Laura felt a sudden rush of gratitude and fear. She knew the dogs were trying to protect them, but she still didn't know from what. As she carried Emma toward the house, a sharp noise broke the silence, a rustling from the woods, and that's when Laura realized, more clearly than ever before, that whatever the dogs were guarding against wasn't just a passing threat. Something was out there, something real. Laura moved swiftly, her heart pounding in her chest as she carried Emma toward the house. The dogs remained in place, a barrier between her and the trees, as if daring anything to come closer. The hairs on the back of Laura's neck stood up. Her thoughts raced in the direction of danger, trying to piece together the puzzle of the dog's behavior. What were they sensing? What was out there? Suddenly, there was another rustle from the woods, this time louder, more pronounced. A shiver ran down Laura's spine. It wasn't the sound of wind through the branches, nor the light scurrying of an animal. This was different. The noise was deliberate, almost too smooth, as if something was moving with purpose. Laura's grip tightened on Emma, but she didn't dare look back. She had to get inside. The dogs, sensing the shift, bristled at the noise, but they didn't retreat. Max growled again, deep and guttural, his body stiff as a board. Daisy stood just a few steps ahead of him, her eyes locked on the shadowy trees, her fur standing on end. They weren't just guarding against the threat. They were preparing for an attack. Almost there, Laura murmured under her breath as she stepped up the back porch stairs. Emma, sensing her mother's unease, buried her face in her mother's shoulder. "It's okay, sweetie," Laura whispered, trying to calm herself as much as her daughter. "We're just going inside to play for a little while. Everything's fine." But everything was not fine. As Laura reached the door, another sound, this time unmistakable, sliced through the air. The faintest rustle of leaves, but it was followed by a sharp snap, like a twig breaking underfoot. Her breath caught. The sound was close. Too close. The dogs reacted immediately. Max shot toward the trees with alarming speed, his growl becoming a fierce snarl. Daisy followed, never leaving Emma's side, but her head turned in the direction of the noise. The air grew thick, almost stifling, and the wind died down completely. All that remained was the heavy silence that hung like a fog over the yard. Laura's pulse raced as she turned her head, just slightly, to glance toward the woods. Through the trees, she saw something shift. Something large and dark, moving through the underbrush. It wasn't the quick dash of a deer, nor the swift dart of a raccoon. This movement was too slow, too deliberate. Laura's breath caught in her throat. It was as if the creature was waiting for the right moment. Her eyes widened as a figure, partially obscured by the thick brush, emerged into the clearing. It was long, its body slithering just beneath the canopy of branches. The snake. It was a massive black rat snake, long and sinuous, its scales glinting faintly in the dim light. Its head was raised, the tongue flicking in and out as it tasted the air. Laura's heart dropped into her stomach. She had never seen a snake so close to her property before, and it was clear now that the dogs weren't just reacting to some random noise. They were protecting Emma from the snake. The snake's eyes, dark and cold, seemed to fixate on the little girl, who remained blissfully unaware of the danger that was lurking just beyond her reach. It was too close for comfort. Max and Daisy positioned themselves even more protectively between the snake and Emma. Max growled louder, and Daisy, with her sharp instincts, stood between the snake and her charge, her body low and ready to leap. They were not about to let the snake near Emma, no matter what. Laura froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she had to act fast, but she couldn't take her eyes off the snake. It was only a few feet away now, its tongue flicking in the air as it slithered forward, inching closer to her daughter. And in that moment, she realized just how much danger they were truly in. Max and Daisy remained locked in place, their bodies taut with alertness as the snake slithered closer. Every instinct Laura had screamed at her to run, to grab Emma and rush inside, but something about the dog's unwavering stance kept her rooted to the spot. Max's growl deepened, almost reverberating through the ground beneath them. Daisy, though smaller, was no less fierce, her eyes never leaving the snake as she positioned herself to block any movement toward Emma. Laura's mind raced. She had to think. She couldn't panic. She had seen snakes in the yard before, but never one this large, this close to her family. It was dangerous, especially with Emma so close to the edge of the yard. But the dogs, they weren't just guarding. They were protecting. The realization hit her with a force she hadn't expected. They were ready to put themselves in harm's way if it meant keeping her daughter safe. With Emma still tightly held in her arms, Laura moved closer to the door, her eyes never leaving the snake. It was now just a few feet away from the line of defense the dogs had drawn between it and Emma. The snake's tongue flicked in and out, sensing the air as though it was calculating its next move. It was too calm, too methodical in its approach. Laura's breath hitched in her throat. Stay calm, she whispered to herself, but the words felt hollow. She could see the muscles in Max's legs tense, his body coiled like a spring ready to snap. Daisy's posture, though smaller, was just as threatening. She was ready for a fight, but Laura knew that wasn't the solution. Not yet. Max, Daisy, get back, Laura said, her voice trembling but firm. She was trying to call them back, hoping to lead them away from the danger. But the dogs didn't move. They wouldn't. Not until the threat was gone. She glanced over her shoulder toward the house, hoping for a sign of help, someone, anyone. But there was no one around. It was just her and the dogs facing this unseen danger. Her only option now was to act quickly. With one hand still clutching Emma, Laura grabbed the broom leaning against the porch wall. Her mind was racing. She knew she needed to distract the snake, get it away from the yard before it posed a threat to her daughter. She wasn't sure how, but she couldn't waste any more time thinking. She had to protect her family. Max and Daisy, sensing her intent, moved a step closer to the snake, their protective instincts kicking into high gear. The growl in Max's throat escalated into a full bark, sharp and insistent. Daisy's low growl joined in, a symphony of warning sounds that filled the yard. The snake's head jerked upward, its tongue flicking faster, as if trying to decide whether to strike or retreat. Laura took a deep breath, steeling herself. With one swift motion, she swung the broom toward the snake, aiming to startle it, to give herself enough time to act. The snake recoiled, its body jerking back in response. It hissed, its tongue darting in and out, but it didn't retreat. It was still sizing them up, still calculating. But this was her moment. Without hesitation, Laura backed toward the door, calling to Max and Daisy. "Come on, guys inside," she urged, her voice a mix of command and desperation. The dogs, sensing that the danger was not yet fully gone, hesitated for a moment. But as she moved, they followed, staying close to her and Emma as they backed up to the porch. With a final push of the broom, Laura managed to steer the snake back toward the woods, but it didn't take long for it to slither away, disappearing back into the underbrush. It was gone. For now. Max and Daisy, still on edge, stood in front of the door, their bodies relaxed but alert. They had done their job. They had protected Emma, and now the danger was over. Laura slammed the door shut behind her, her heart racing. She set Emma down, gently holding her close. Emma, wide-eyed but calm, didn't seem to understand the full extent of what had just happened. But Laura did, and as she looked at Max and Daisy, she realized how deeply her trust in them had grown. They weren't just pets. They were family, and they had just saved Emma's life. The door clicked shut behind Laura with a finality that made her exhale a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her heart pounded in her chest, still racing from the adrenaline of the encounter. Emma, now safely inside, was quiet, her wide eyes still focused on the dogs who stood protectively near the door. Max and Daisy had immediately turned their attention to the yard, their eyes scanning every inch, as if ensuring the threat was truly gone. The air in the house was thick, heavy with the residue of the tension that had filled the yard moments ago. Laura pressed her back against the door, her hands shaking as she glanced at her daughter. Emma's face, though calm, was a mirror of Laura's own unease. The little girl didn't understand the full scope of what had just happened. She had been oblivious to the snake's proximity, to the danger lurking just beyond the edge of their yard. But Laura knew, and she couldn't shake the image of the snake's cold, calculating eyes, watching her every move. "Mommy, what happened?" Emma asked softly, her small voice breaking through the silence. Laura knelt down, pulling Emma into her arms and hugging her tightly. "Nothing, sweetheart. You're safe now," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She had always prided herself on being strong for Emma, but this was different. This had been a close call, one that could have ended very differently if it weren't for Max and Daisy. The dogs, sensing that the immediate danger had passed, slowly began to relax. Max, ever the vigilant protector, gave one final look out the window before turning to rest his head on the floor, his body still tensed, but no longer on edge. Daisy, too, padded quietly to Laura's side, her eyes softening as she sat down beside them. The change in their demeanor was almost immediate, a shift from defensive alertness to calm assurance. Laura stroked Daisy's head gently, the weight of what had just transpired sinking in. "Good dogs," she murmured, her voice filled with gratitude. She had always known that dogs were protective, but she hadn't realized the extent of their instincts. They had acted without hesitation, without question, and without fear. They had kept Emma safe from a real and present danger. Max stood up suddenly, his head turning toward the back door with a sharp bark that made Laura jump. It wasn't the growl from before, but it was enough to remind her that the dogs hadn't completely let down their guard. They were still aware, still watching, and something told her that the danger wasn't entirely over. She glanced at the clock on the wall. The sun, which had been so bright and reassuring earlier, was now dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the room. The peaceful, serene afternoon she had expected was slipping away, replaced by an unfamiliar, unsettling stillness. The world outside felt too quiet, almost suffocating. And though the snake had retreated into the woods, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that something else was out there, lurking just beyond the trees. "Max, what is it?" Laura asked, her voice barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would break the fragile calm. But Max's bark had been sharp, urgent. He was still on alert, still aware of something she couldn't see. Daisy's ears twitched, and she shifted restlessly at Laura's feet. It was clear the dogs were far from relaxed. They were waiting, watching, ready for whatever came next. Laura stood up slowly, her eyes still locked on the door, as though expecting it to open at any moment. The dog's unwavering stance seemed to say it all. The snake may have gone, but there was more to this than she could see. Something was watching them, and it wasn't over yet. The quiet inside the house felt oppressive, almost stifling. Laura's mind raced as she paced from one room to the next, the sound of her footsteps the only thing breaking the silence. Max and Daisy were still on high alert, their eyes scanning the yard, their heads turning toward the back door every few seconds. Every movement from the dogs felt like a warning, an echo of the danger they had just faced. Outside, the sun had almost set, casting long, angular shadows across the yard. What had started as a bright, peaceful afternoon was now dark and foreboding. Laura found herself glancing out of every window, trying to pierce through the veil of darkness that had fallen over the land. The woods, once familiar and comforting, now seemed more menacing than ever. She stopped near the kitchen window, staring out at the trees. The rustling in the underbrush earlier had been unsettling, but now, as darkness crept over the yard, the silence felt even more unnerving. Laura's eyes flicked to the spot where the snake had been moments before. The brush was still, the faint outline of the snake's path visible in the dirt, but nothing moved now. It was as though the forest had gone completely still. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone, that something was watching her, watching them. Max's head turned sharply toward the back door again, his ears cocked. Daisy, too, stood and trotted toward the door, her paws clicking softly against the hardwood floor. Laura's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just the dogs being cautious anymore. It was something else, something deeper. They knew. They knew something was out there. Suddenly, Max barked loudly, his voice filled with urgency. He ran to the door, his body stiff with tension, and stood there, eyes fixed on the yard. Daisy joined him immediately, her growl low but unmistakable. Laura's stomach clenched. Her pulse raced. This wasn't just instinct anymore. This was a warning. A real, tangible warning. "Max." Daisy stopped, she said, her voice trembling as she hurried to the door. She opened it cautiously, scanning the yard. The dogs didn't move, standing firm in their defensive stance. Laura stepped outside, the cool evening air hitting her skin like a sudden jolt of ice. Everything was still. Too still. She looked into the woods again, her breath catching in her throat as she scanned the darkness. The trees, normally a comforting backdrop to their home, now seemed to loom over her, their twisted branches reaching out like fingers, blocking out the last light of the setting sun. It was as if the woods were hiding something, or someone. a faint rustle, a soft, deliberate step. Laura's breath caught. She wasn't imagining it. She heard something. Something was moving in the woods just beyond the tree line. Max's growl deepened, and Daisy stepped closer to Laura, her body tense and coiled, ready to react. The two dogs were silent, but their bodies spoke volumes. They knew something was there, something neither Laura nor Emma could see. "Mommy." Emma's voice rang out from the doorway, breaking the tense silence. Laura glanced back at her daughter, who was standing in the threshold, her face filled with concern. "Stay inside, sweetie," Laura said quickly, her voice tight. "Lock the door behind you." Emma's eyes widened, but she didn't argue. She stepped back into the house, shutting the door softly. Laura turned back to the yard, her gaze fixed on the edge of the woods. The rustling sound came again, closer this time. It was unmistakable. Something was moving in the shadows, watching her. Max barked again, more urgently this time. His tail was rigid, his body leaning forward, every muscle primed for action. Daisy stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the trees, her growl rising in pitch. Laura's heart pounded in her chest. Whatever was out there, it wasn't leaving. She could feel the tension building in the air, like a storm about to break. The dogs were ready to protect her, ready to fight whatever threat was out there. But what was it? And why wasn't it showing itself? Laura's breath was shallow as she stood in the doorway, her eyes locked on the shadows of the woods. Every muscle in her body tensed, and though the dogs were beside her, she felt more alone than ever. The rustling from the trees had stopped, but she knew better than to believe the danger had passed. Max and Daisy's behavior told her everything she needed to know. Something was out there, something they couldn't yet see. Max barked again, his voice sharp and insistent. Daisy's growl had become a steady rumble in her chest, her stance unwavering. The two of them were ready to spring into action at any moment. Laura's heart raced as she scanned the yard, trying to make sense of what was happening. Her mind raced, conjuring 1,000 possibilities, none of them good. She had to protect Emma. That was all that mattered. The faint sound of a twig snapping broke the silence again, and Laura flinched. It was louder this time, unmistakable. Her eyes flicked toward the tree line, narrowing as she searched for movement. She took a step forward, her body instinctively following the dogs as they stood at the ready, watching the darkness. Then it happened. A figure emerged from the trees. At first, Laura thought it was just a trick of the fading light, some animal slipping between the shadows. But as it came into clearer view, she realized it wasn't an animal at all. It was a person, a man tall and thin, moving slowly from the woods, his steps deliberate but calm. Her breath caught in her throat. She had no idea who this man was or what he was doing on her property, but one thing was clear. He had been hiding in the woods, watching. Max was the first to react, barking furiously, his teeth bared in a threatening snarl. Daisy stepped forward, her body poised for a leap, every inch of her focused on the intruder. "Get inside, Emma," Laura shouted, her voice shaking as she turned toward the door. Her daughter, hearing the urgency in her mother's voice, hesitated only a moment before quickly running back into the house and locking the door behind her. Laura stood her ground, her heart thudding in her chest as the man continued to move forward. His expression was blank, unreadable. It was as if he didn't even acknowledge the barking dogs, didn't care about the alarm they were raising. But Laura saw something in his eyes, something dark, something that made her stomach churn. She instinctively stepped back, her eyes darting to the dogs. Max and Daisy were still blocking the man's path, their growls low and steady, but their bodies still poised for action. They were protecting her, protecting Emma, and they weren't going to let anyone get past them. "Who are you?" Laura's voice trembled with a mix of fear and confusion. The man didn't respond at first, his gaze fixed on her. He took another step forward, as though testing the dogs, but Max lunged with a powerful bark, forcing the man to stop. The tension in the air was suffocating. Every second felt like an eternity. Laura had no idea what this man wanted or why he had come, but one thing was certain. He wasn't here for a friendly visit. His eyes darted from Max to Daisy and then back to Laura, and for a split second, it looked like he was weighing his options. Then, without warning, he turned and retreated back into the woods, disappearing as quickly as he appeared. Laura stood frozen, her heart still racing. The dog's growls faded into the distance as they slowly relaxed, but their eyes never left the tree line. The danger had passed for now. Laura took a shaky breath, looking toward the house. "It's okay," she whispered to herself. "You're safe." She walked back to the door, still uncertain of what had just happened. The man had never spoken a word, but the fear in his eyes, the way he seemed to be watching her, lingered in her mind. She didn't know if he would come back or if the danger was truly over. But one thing was clear. Max and Daisy had saved her family again. She turned to the dogs, her voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her hand resting gently on their fur. They had given everything to protect her, and they had succeeded. Max gave a soft whine, nuzzling her hand. Daisy wagged her tail, her body still tense but relieved. Together, they had kept Emma safe from whatever threat had been hiding in the shadows. Laura didn't know what the future held, but with her dogs by her side, she knew one thing for sure. They would face it together.